Well, I got to know David Bohm quite well when I was a lecturer at Birkbeck College in London, and Bohm was there at Birkbeck too. And he, Bohm, and Basil Hiley and I used to have get-togethers, I think pretty well every week for quite a period. There were quite a few graduate students also, I think, in the physics group. I think we more or less tended to meet in the physics department, and I think I was the only one from the maths department. But we had many very interesting discussions, and Bohm was somebody who I got a lot from, and his things about probably the Bohm version of the Einstein-Podolsky-Rosen experiment using spin was something that intrigued me very much. But also his ideas and quantum mechanics, which I found very deep. I always thought that he was very much like a wave function himself, that you'd ask a question, you see, a very specific question, and he would be very focused and give you a deep, very focused answer to that question. And then it would start to spread out, and it would encompass a little more about physics, and it spread out, and then about philology and about human nature and so on. And I'd get a bit lost about what's going on. So I'd need another question. I'd ask him another question, and whoop, the conversation would focus itself very deeply on this particular point, and he would give a very succinct answer to that, and then again he would spread out like this. So it's just the way a wave function has. You measure it, is the particle here, and whoop, you see, and then it spreads out again like this. So it intrigued me that very much. I think non-locality was a big part of it, as far as I can recall, but and the idea that physics involved that aspect of things made a big impression on me. A bit hard to be specific, but I clearly gained a lot. I mean, I also liked his book on quantum mechanics, and it was, as far as I know, the only book which really went into the philosophy underlying the subject very much, and a very good book, which I understood he wrote in order to convince himself of the conventional interpretation of quantum mechanics, and he failed miserably, according to him. He never tried to change the implications of quantum mechanics. So I think this is a way in which I suppose I differed from what he was doing, because he was trying to have a different way of looking at quantum mechanics, which had an ontology which made more sense. So it sort of hung together in a way that the conventional viewpoint did not, and I think that's true, it does to a degree, but I never felt that that was quite right, that one should be looking not for something which was another way of looking at the conventional theory, but try to see what the limits to the conventional theory in its actual predictions would be. So I think his view was different. I can't remember what my view was at those times, but certainly I developed ideas that no, you should be able to see a difference between conventional quantum mechanics and something which made a better, what I would regard as an ontology. I mean, I thought that that was important, that he actually respected that aspect of things. You've got to have a view of what the theory has, how it relates to reality. And so many people didn't think of that as an important question. In the Copenhagen view, it's more or less regarded as a means to getting an answer, but you don't give any reality to the, I mean, that's the whole point. This is just in the mind of the physicists. Well, you see, the picture we have normally is that something happening over here is independent. Something, I mean, this is what these experiments, particularly what Bohm's example, you have something which starts off without any spin, and it produces two particles which spin in the most basic way, and because this didn't have spin initially, then these have to have compensating spins, which could be in any direction. But if you measure this in one direction, the other one is automatically the other way. But yet, how does it know to be pointing the other way when it's completely symmetrical? It doesn't have any direction aspect to it at all. And it looks as though the very process of measuring this spin and finding it to be spinning at about a certain axis automatically makes that one spin about the opposite axis. And this is a non-local feature. I mean, you might say, well, there's a signal translating, from this to this, but that signal would have to pass go faster than light. And there isn't any physical signal. And these things are you can't say that the description here of what's going on here is the description of this, without it being what's called entangled, what's going on over here. So it's non-local because this thing over here is part of a big system which stretches between here and here. And this is before they'd actually done experiments and all these things where you, first of all, it was a few feet and then a few kilometers and 143 kilometers or whatever it was, and now it's thousands, I think. I can't remember what the current limit is, the current record is. The problem is, if this thing actually sent a signal, then because of the ideas of special relativity, that signal could not propagate faster than the speed of light, or you'd have contradictions. But it's a subtle thing that somehow the entanglement between this and this can't be understood as a signal which could carry information, otherwise you'd be in trouble. And there are a lot of subtleties about this which sort of originated with David Bohm, well, Einstein and two of his collaborators, Podolsky and Rosen, wrote a paper, but the ideas that David Bohm had on this were, in my view, a lot clearer and gave a much better picture of what these entanglements are. And then later on, John Bell went into it much more deeply to show that really the view one has to have is that the physics isn't local, that there's something connecting these things. So that, well...
No, sorry, go ahead.
Well, I mean, what I was trying to do in my talk, although I admit that most of it was technicalities which I wasn't expecting people to pick up on because that wasn't the point. I was just trying to show that there is a very interconnected theory, and not just saying an idea or something, but the kind of non-locality that you can get in mathematics seems to mirror this kind of non-locality in physics. And this is this example of cohomology. So I had this picture of what I regard as an impossible triangle. People call it a tribar, where you look at it and it looks as though you've got these rods glued together, right angles, another right angle, another right angle, and it makes a triangle which couldn't exist in ordinary space. But this is an example of this cohomology idea. You say, what's wrong with the picture? And you say, is it here? No, because if you remove, you can remove the impossibility of blocking out that bit or blocking out this or this, and it's completely irrelevant where you block it out. You've got to block it somewhere, and then it becomes possible. But you can't localize what's wrong with it. So what's wrong with the picture is a non-local feature. And so what I'm trying to say is that these non-localities in physical theory are similar, and I believe very much connected with this idea of this kind of mathematics which tells you about what's called cohomology. It's an inconsistency in the picture as a whole, but which you can't pinpoint as having any location. But yet it's a feature of the entire thing. And that's what you get in quantum mechanics. You can't say that this thing in itself, well, you can treat it as a thing on its own, but the way in which it's entangled with the other thing is one of these non-local ideas. And there are mathematical structures which very much mirror that kind of non-locality. And this was what I was trying to express in my talk. What's the most local thing you can think of? Well, a point, you see. And in relativity, it's not a point in space only. It has an instantaneous existence. It's what people call an event. It's blip. It's a point with no temporal extension. So it's a momentary thing. So that's a point in space-time. You might say that's the most basic thing. So what I'm saying is, well, you don't look at it that way. You look at it, the basic thing, or let's say a more basic thing, is the light ray. So you imagine you sit at that point and you look out at the sky. If you know, wherever it is, if you're in space, the sky goes all the way around, you see, and you look out at the sky, and that family of light rays coming into your eye, each one is a non-local thing, but that entire family is that local point. So you're kind of changing the view of what you regard as local. You're saying what's the local thing is not the point anymore, but it's the whole light ray, and that's treated as a local thing. And it turns upside down the normal view of what we think of as locality. So that was where this started from. And then the idea I was describing about the triangle is something which I didn't expect, but it's in a way a more subtle way in which something can be non-local. And so the view I'm holding, and I definitely hold to this, is that it's that kind of non-locality which quantum mechanics is exhibiting. And you can certainly see that also. My example was only for a single particle, but if you have 2 particles or 3 particles, you can see again, it's higher kinds of cohomology. And it is the same phenomenon in this description, that you see that kind of mathematics, which is a genuinely non-local mathematics, mirroring, or maybe in a way describing, in a profound sense, the non-locality that we see in nature. What we regard as Bohmian mechanics, which is a way of looking at quantum theory, you can see these 2, I don't know if it's quite what he was referring to here, but there are 2 levels of reality. So you can say the particle has one level, and then there is something which guides the particle, which has a different kind of ontology to it. And so this idea that you could have different levels, and I presume that Bohm was talking about other things, maybe such as mental reality and things of that sort. But I'm afraid I would probably, as I said, I don't know what the details of the discussions were, but I would probably side with Einstein. I think that we want to have one overall picture of a thing that we refer to as reality. But it may be a kind of reality which is very foreign to what we currently understand as reality. It does tend to happen that that you think you find answers, and it uncovers more and more questions that you've never even conceived of as questions previously. Whether that will continue indefinitely, who knows? But I agree that does seem to be a feature of many of the questions that are raised now. Puzzles come about from a greater knowledge about what's going on than people had before. I mean, some of these non-local things people had no conception of. They only come about because of understanding quantum mechanics, which gives us a better understanding of what nature is like, but reveals problems that we'd never contemplated before. If you're trying to make a theory which makes better ontological sense, but does not deviate from current quantum mechanics, and that's what I think Bohm was trying to do, and I think Basil Hiley is following in that same tradition, I suppose. I mean, I think probably Basil is more sympathetic to looking at things which would deviate from current theory. But certainly the quantum potential is a way of looking at a wave function, if you like, and you split it up in a certain way which enables you to have this sort of 2 aspects of it can be viewed in different ways and give them a somewhat different ontological status. And I think it's very interesting. And I certainly, I very much approve of people trying to do this kind of thing, and I think that's a step. It's a step. I think, let's put it like this. If you're looking at interpretations or ways of looking at quantum mechanics, my view is that probably the Bohm, Hiley, de Broglie, I don't know how you split this up, way of looking at quantum mechanics has the most satisfactory ontology. So you have a picture of what constitutes reality without changing quantum mechanics. And if you're not going to change quantum mechanics, to do it that way makes more sense than anything else I've seen. But as I say, my view is that there would be, in my view, a limit to that. And I rather hope there's a limit to it, because I rather hope that experiments which are even people are looking at and have been for some years might reveal an actual limit to the validity of current quantum theory. I think I would highlight his serious tackling the philosophy of it and the ontology question, which, I mean, in a certain sense, I can respect people like Niels Bohr, who said, well, okay, this is what you're supposed to do, don't ask questions. It's more or less that. Don't try and probe deeper what's going on. And maybe, in a certain sense, that's what you had to do, because if physicists spent their whole time worrying about the foundations, they wouldn't have done the good things that they did in quantum physics. But I don't like that point of view myself. It doesn't make sense to me. I said, no, we really want a theory which hangs together. And Bohm was a leading figure in that. And I think I very much respect him in that particular regard. And I think, as I said with his book on quantum mechanics, even though it was at that stage not deviating from the Copenhagen view, he was exploring the philosophical implications and this sort of thing in ways that other people had been, in a way, too frightened to do, I think. So I think he played a big role in making this serious and making it something that we should look at and bringing up points which are, such as the non-locality issue. Say these are serious things that we've got to face up to in quantum mechanics. And if you're going to regard this theory as describing reality, you've got to realize that it has these implications, which you may not like too much. So yes, I think he had a big role to play there. I'm not sure of whether I can answer your question too specifically. I mean, I think that I see quite a lot of threat to mainstream physics. I mean, in other areas, I can see things which, if I've done something in some area which is somewhat different from the mainstream, there is an awful lot of people kind of retreating into their fixed positions and not taking seriously outside views. I mean, this is a two-edged thing, because there's an awful lot of ideas. There are an awful lot of ideas floating around which are completely crazy, and you've got to make sure that you don't get too roped into this sort of thing. So whether this is something particular about Bohm's ideas, I don't know. I think things relating to consciousness, and I've experienced that myself, that a lot of physicists sort of thought, no, you shouldn't dabble in that. That's not for physicists. On the other hand, a lot of people did, in a way, like von Neumann and people who, Wigner, and people who tried to, well, there's the sort of view that it takes maybe a conscious being to reduce the quantum state. The quantum state, things sort of spread out, entangled, spread out, and then somebody comes around and looks at it, conscious being, and then whoop, does it become more real at that moment? That's not my view, but a lot of very serious physicists took that view. So I'm not sure whether this is a uniform position, but there were, I agree, a lot of physicists who said, no, you shouldn't dabble with that sort of thing. Just take what Niels Bohr says and don't ask questions. I've been promoting this for about 10 years. And for a good proportion of those 10 years, I think about 6, I can't remember when the observational things started to come in, there does seem to be evidence for it, which has been, for not entirely bad reasons, ignored by the mainstream cosmologists in a slightly unpleasant way. I found this when I was in Princeton at a meeting a couple of years ago, and some of the reaction I found quite unpleasant. But they have certain fixed views about what the universe is doing, and if you come up with a contrary picture, it's not that they prove you're wrong, or they just won't look at it. They just say, why should we pay any attention? But in a certain sense, you can see that, because the number of crazy theories there are about cosmology is vast. And so they probably just put it into the same category. And they might have some respect for the science that I do, but that was some years ago, and now I'm an old geezer. They probably don't take me seriously. They may be respectful and be polite, but these things are... And I see this myself, people not as old as I am, who I worry about the things that they do now. I think the trouble with a lot of what I'm doing doesn't have much immediate in that direction. You see, well, practical you can take in two ways. You can say, is there an experiment, practical or otherwise? It's not that it's going to help anybody make their lives any happier, apart from physicists. But nevertheless, there's an experiment. Well, Twistor theory has been disturbingly remote from experiment. I'm not happy with that. I am hopeful that there might be experiments. It's partly the technology has developed so incredibly in recent years that the precision there is now in space-time measurements is quite extraordinary. And to combine that with quantum mechanical things, I think there is possibly scope, even in twistor theory, which is pretty remote. And that's not what drives it. You see, I've never been driven by experiment. I mean, I think ultimately it has to be. There has been a development from about 2005, 2004, whenever it was. Edward Witten, who'd known vaguely about twistor theory for a long time, realized there was a way of combining it with ideas from string theory which could simplify calculations which involve high energy scatterings. And these do have a role to play in I think, eliminating the background in things like in CERN and so on. Now, I've never studied this. There's a big group of people with whom I work who have done important things in that area. And that is where twistor theory has had an impact in high energy physics. I mean, it has actually, but this is technical use. I mean, the Feynman diagrams have been the staple thing that you use for calculating these things. And you use Feynman diagrams to calculate. It's absolutely out of the question. You have these vast numbers of these things. You put them on a computer and you still have to but then you use some of these techniques, not just with twistor theory, but twistor theory plays a big role here. And suddenly they become much, much simpler. Okay, that's useful to people who want to do these calculations. It's not what I'm doing, because although it does use twistor theory, it's only in a certain sense a rather primitive part of twistor theory. It's not where these subtleties like the cohomology start to come in. I do think that it ought to have some impact on particle physics, but this depends on the palatial ideas that I was vaguely hinting at in my talk today, that they should be extended from the general relativity applications to those in. So I did mention that, I mean, I did this original thing with the curved spaces, but then my graduate student, Richard Ward, very quickly sought how to combine that with gauge theories. And so you could do exactly the same thing, well, it's exactly sort of the same thing, using the basic ideas to treat gauge theories. But it suffered from the same problem, which was this googly problem, that you handle all the left-handed parts of the interactions, but not the right-handed ones. So you can't directly use it. But it still had an impact on what people did in pure mathematics. Did quite a big impact there. You might say, what's that got? What use is that to people? I don't know, but it's pure mathematics, keeps pure mathematicians going, and the interesting things. But with the palatial ideas, now this is only an opinion because I haven't seen it work yet. The same ideas applied to the Yang-Mills theory, that is to say the particle interactions, as I was applying to general relativity, those ideas should work also for the Yang-Mills theories. And then one might start to see an impact on particle physics, which could affect mainstream physics in serious ways. But it's this googly problem, which is, I would say, for about 40 years. It's a long time to be frustrated by one thing. So I feel much more optimistic, although the mathematics has proved to be really quite tricky, and I'm not quite sure exactly the right route to take on that. My father certainly inspired me, well, in many ways, but particularly he had his own brass telescope, you see, and I can't remember when this was, but he looked and he said, "There's Saturn, let's have a look." Well, I've seen pictures of Saturn and all that, but you look at that, wow, it's really there. That is really there, that extraordinary object. And to see it like that it creates a different impression. And then just a year or so ago, I was in Tenerife. Actually, it was not actually in Tenerife, it was one of the other islands. And there was a telescope. You could see Jupiter and its moon so clearly, even with my macular degeneration. And that's amazing. And just to even a not a terribly powerful telescope, and you can see, gosh, that thing you see pictures of, and it makes a huge difference to see it's really there. I don't know quite why, because I didn't think people were making these things up all the time, but just to see it there with just a few lenses. I got a lot from my father, and quite a lot from my older brother. He was extremely, well, he was very precocious, much more than I was, but he read a lot, and he read me. I remember him reading Gamoff's books, the what were the two called? Where there was Mr. Tompkins in Wonderland and Mr. Tompkins Explores the Atom, and this was fascinating to me. But my father, we used to discuss science an awful lot, go for long walks. It was more on the biological side and so on, but he also was fascinated by mathematics, and these things made a big impression on me. A God as a sort of being, in the sense that people tend to refer to him when they call him a him. Why not a her? Why not an it? They don't like to call it an it. Whereas if it were an it, I would have more sympathy towards the object, because I can't think of this being as a being in the sense of being that being. I mean, I can't imagine being a God or God. It doesn't make any sense to me. Or somebody who could somehow influence what people do, or I mean, it doesn't make any sense to me at all. Certainly one sees the random way in which the people are treated, absolutely nothing to do with how virtuous they are, and so on. I mean, it just makes no sense to me. So I certainly have no attraction to the idea of a belief in a being in that sense. My father had a deep interest in consciousness. You see, he took it more in the more obvious direction. That is to say, he became very interested in mental things that were wrong with people, and mental inheritance of mental disease was his speciality. And I never took that route, but I was influenced by him very much, and trying to see what it is to be a being, and somehow to be a conscious being. And there are huge puzzles about that, which one has to face up to. And sometimes people ask me this question. You see, there was somebody recently at a meeting, and he was asking me this question. He said, well, what do I really think there's some greater being? I said, well, what I do think is there's something fishy going on. So he said, okay, I would say there's something fishy going on, but I can't see it as a being that somehow has our interests at heart. I mean, okay, Einstein used to speak of God, but it was in a very impersonal way. I mean, his God was much more the workings of the universe kind of thing. But
Nature.
Yes, and he had a way of speaking in those terms, which I don't tend not to, because I think it sort of conjures up slightly the wrong image. But is there an overall scheme of things? Well, what could it be? I mean, I have the faintest idea. I mean, there's something fishy going on, yeah. What's fishy? But I like to try and think that one can maybe scratch a little off the surface and see what might be going on behind. But it's I don't see any clear answers. I think Bohm did make an important contribution. As I said earlier, I think making it respectable to ask these philosophical questions and to try and make an ontology of quantum mechanics which somehow hang together. And I think he did have an important role to play. Whether it's an important role so much in what mainstream people call physics, I'm not sure, but I don't think that's all. I think his role was important as a counterbalance in a way to the sort of who cares about philosophy role of physics. And I think he was an important counterbalance to that.